Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is on his way to the United States, where he will meet President Donald Trump in Washington on Tuesday. They previously met last February, just weeks before launching the war in Iran. Netanyahu says he also intends to travel to New York for the UN General Assembly in September. He accused its mayor, Zoran Mamdani, of fomenting hate over his plea to the federal government to arrest Netanyahu for war crimes. Introducing Geist Pinfold, Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Gulf International Forum and Lecturer in International Security at King's College London. A warm welcome to the programme. Joining us from London. Rob, reports in US media suggest this US pause in attacks on Iran in the past 2 days may be driven as much by dwindling military stockpiles of precision munitions such as Tomahawks as by his potential desire for diplomacy. How much is logistics rather than an apparent tactical space for negotiations forcing Washington's hand right now, do you think?
Well, I think that's a very pertinent question, Neve. And, if you look, actually, we don't know the exact statistics, of course, as to how much the US burned through its supplies during the war, but the signs are that this was a pretty serious use of everything the US had saved for a rainy day. We're talking at least 50% of the US's supply of Patriot missiles, at least 50% of its supply of THAAD missiles. And you mentioned Tomahawks. The US has fired over 1,000 Tomahawks during the war. It can make around 90 to 100 every year. So it's going to take a very, very long time for the US to restock what it's used. And it's, of course, important to note that this is the US's global stockpile of these munitions. So it is basically, and I think, the interesting thing to consider here is how little desired strategic effect it's had. So you've had the global superpower, the US, throwing the kitchen sink at Iran militarily in terms of burning through all of its, so much of its missile stock that is obviously not meant to be used just in the Middle East, but also as a deterrent in Asia against China, in Europe against Russia. And the fact is that the US has failed to induce what it wanted to induce from Iran, i.e. regime change, or at least a systemic change in Iran's behaviour. So it really demonstrates the lack of strategic foresight here and the dwindling utility of military force.
I mean, irrespective, I guess, of the arithmetic surrounding what munitions they have or don't have, Donald Trump says we have far more munitions than anyone in the world and far more than we need. And the Iranians are most certainly implying that they are ready should there be any further military escalation. But at the same time, Rob, there is this appetite for talks, and tentatively we've seen the Omanis and the Iranians having their own talks to one side. What do you make of any kind of positive movement forward towards a negotiated move out of all of this right now?
Yeah, that's exactly right. This is not a return to open conflict. Neither side seems to actually want a return to open conflict. What both sides have been doing is trying to use military force as a signalling exercise to show the other party that they are not coming at the negotiations from a position of weakness, but also to demonstrate resilience and show that they are actually prepared to escalate if and when is necessary. The fact that we are now in a lull in the fighting demonstrates that both sides preference talks. This suggests that there has been some kind of tentative progress. We don't know what yet, but the issues are still profound and very, very difficult to overcome through either diplomacy or indeed through military force. There's the divide over the Strait of Hormuz, the fact that Iran does not want to give up control of the Strait of Hormuz. There's, of course, now the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the Houthis who are blockading that to Saudi shipping. So the long and short of it is that even if the missiles are stopped firing for now between the US and Iran, the global economy is still going to suffer serious second-order effects from this conflict.
A huge amount to untangle if the drive is towards diplomacy, Rob. On this, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, we've just said, he's heading to Washington. At the same time, would appear to be, as you say, in this lull, this holding pattern of tit-for-tat strikes. Some are calling it potentially space for negotiations, but there's a huge concern, isn't there, that whenever Netanyahu goes to Washington, D.C., goes to the Oval Office, he potentially has the president's ear. Do you expect his visit to precede any kind of decisive Trump action?
Well, I think it's interesting to see how the wind has changed within Israel and how Israelis see the conflict. And indeed, this visit by Netanyahu to the US was on the cards for a very, very long time. And there was all sorts of speculation that Netanyahu might not even meet Trump, which I think is demonstrative of the crisis in US-Israel relations, and particularly of the increasing lack of trust between those two leaders, Trump and Netanyahu. But when you look at this from an Israeli angle, when the war initially started, the Israelis were feeling very, very sure of themselves that they'd managed to get the US to go in with them from the conflict from day one, which was different to the previous year's war between Israel and Iran, of course, where the US only joined late. But as the conflict unfolded, the Israelis, like anyone else, found Trump very, very difficult to predict, and were increasingly frustrated at his ability to sort of cut deals or negotiate with all sorts of actors in the region, be it the Gulf states and indeed Iran, without involving the Israelis, but then tying the Israelis to agreements. So there has been an increasing disillusionment, I think it's fair to say, in Israel, in the centers of decision making there, in terms of throwing their weight behind the United States and simply joining the war from the beginning, because there's this fear that Israel will then be compelled to cease fire when the United States determines it should cease fire, rather than when Israel determines when it should cease fire. So having the US as a partner, sure, it means that they can hit more targets in Iran, but it also means that the Israelis are more constrained than they feel comfortable with.
Rob, really good to hear your thoughts on all of this. Dr. Rob Geist Pinfold, lecturer in international security at King's College London. Thank you, Rob.